Aloha and welcome to Island Connections. I'm Ibrahim Aoude. Palestine, Zionism, and occupation is the topic for today. And with us, we have two gentlemen, Robert Stiver, and he is an activist in the community and he works on justice issues. Also, Raji Abuzalaf, he's also an activist who works on justice issues, and both are interested in Palestine. They have their own TV show on Olelo called Holy Land Peace. So thank you both for coming. Welcome. And I want to begin by asking you, Bob, about how you become involved in matters of justice, and you focusing now on the question of Palestine and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
I'll be glad to, Ibrahim. I'm glad to be here between two gentlemen and good friends. Actually, my involvement with justice goes back many, many years. My mother was a Quaker, and she was avid for justice. She was a very emotional lady and spoke out for the blacks in the south of our country back in her days. And that's how I got my kind of genetic start in it. But I dropped out of college in 1963 and joined the Army. And along the course of my 4-year Army career, the Army assigned me to Monterey, California, to the Defense Language Institute, and I was required to learn the Arabic language and study its culture for 1 year, 1964 to 65. And I think typically to anyone who has an objective mind, one's eyes can only be opened immediately when one is exposed to such a situation. And I emphasize in 1964, that was only, 16 years or so after 1948. The Palestinians in those days were already referred to in the instructor community there as the intellectuals of the Middle East. My homeroom teacher was a Jordanian, but he was displaced with his family in 1948 from Palestine, so he's a Palestinian refugee, and wound up as, I presume, a U.S. civil servant teaching the Arabic language in Monterey, California. So ever since then, and that's 48 going on 49 years, I have been immersed in seeking justice and peace and liberation for the Palestinian people. And that includes, of course, the Palestinian Christians and the Muslim community of Palestine.
Well, thank you. And Raji, you are also involved in justice matters, and so what brings you to that kind of position?
Well, thanks for having us, Ibrahim, and we appreciate the opportunity to express and share. For me, I am a Palestinian, and I wasn't born in Palestine. My parents were driven out in 1948. I was born in Kuwait, and I spent my early childhood between Kuwait and Lebanon, going back and forth because the families were kind of split up that way. And we immigrated to the United States in the 60s. And the 60s was a pretty active time for a lot of people all over the world. And growing up here in America, I mean, I was raised as an American and, fell in love with the Constitution. And when the war in Vietnam came, I became very vocal about it, along with many other people that I was in high school with, because it didn't, the policies that governments took, especially the U.S. government, didn't really match the philosophies of the Constitution and other things that we had learned was right and good and just, and So that's kind of how I began as far as being active in justice matters. And then just being a Palestinian, I know a lot from our own heritage about the situation there. And then I made it my obligation to find out and do my own research, not just what I heard from my parents or, all our friends and everything. I wanted to find out what history said. And there was a lot of documentation. There is a lot of documentation available. As we proceed now between the 60s and here we are now 50 years later, we see that a lot of that documentation is being rewritten by certain parties. But at that time, there was a lot of documentation, and I just did all the research I could to make myself aware of the real situation, and I wanted to become vocal about it. The other thing I can offer you is that I made a personal decision to, even though we're a Christian family, I wanted to make a personal decision to follow Christ, and did my own research also in the matters of religion. And when I started really being serious about following Christ and following the Bible, then I started to see matters of the Holy Land in a completely different way. And they're different than what, the mainstream religion tries to educate people, and I use the word educate very loosely here, but so we want to also re-educate people according to what the Bible should be interpreted as. So that's my other area, if you will.
Yeah, right. Bob, you've been following current events in the Palestinian situation and also in the Middle East. But in terms of the Palestinian situation, what kind of new developments have occurred, like in the past, shall we say, couple of weeks that you are aware of that are pertinent to what we will be talking about?
Well, there are current events going on constantly, and I do try to keep abreast of them. One thing that happened, perhaps it has kind of resolved itself 2 weeks ago, that a commission appointed by Bibi Netanyahu, the former terrorist prime minister of Israel, who commissioned this commission to look into the settlement activities in the occupied territories. Well, this commission came out and said, there is no occupation. Everything the settlers are doing there is legal and above board, and let's have at it. Well, Netanyahu has not been able or willing to release that to the public because he would get an international outcry against it. But in the meantime, the beat of occupation goes on. We have incidents every day whereby, for example, most recently, the Zionists have refocused their emphasis on harassment of the Palestinians. They're now going after farmers and fishermen in the occupied West Bank. And that's relatively a new phenomenon, but that's the way the Zionists work. They go from one people group to another in a different area, and they're always just applying pressure. The ultimate game, of course, or objective is to drive the Palestinians out.
But, like the Zionist Israelis say that, in fact, well, this is their land, right, Raji? And they are, there's a rationale for them to do this. They are justified in doing what they are doing to the Palestinians. And in fact, there are all these colonists, they call them settlers, who really do a lot of damage to Palestinian life and Palestinian businesses and drive them out of their land, etc. So is that not an occupation? What does that tell you, I mean, from a Palestinian point of view?
From a Palestinian point of view, is different than an objective point of view. I'm not sure exactly which one. I'll respond to the question. From a Palestinian point of view, of course, it is not their land. Neither Israel nor the Palestinian territories, which are under occupation, are their land. In an objective point of view, I would say that the international community decided years ago, via the United Nations rulings and such, that a portion of the land would become Israel and would become their land. And the other portion would remain Palestine. And so there you have the two different viewpoints. So that's a kind of a complex question with complex answers. But the simple part of it is, if we just look at the Palestinian territories, there's nobody on earth other than the Zionists and their supporters that can say that that's their land. That is Palestine. That's the Palestinian territories. They have, since 1967, illegally occupied it and have illegal settlements. And the United Nations has ruled over and over repeatedly that this is and it's condemned by the UN. And so they're in offense and breaking the international laws. However, the United Nations can cry out all day that it's not been enforced, and because of United States support of Israel and other complex matters which would explain why the U.S. supports Israel, we would say that the United Nations is either incapable or unwilling, or both, of enforcing the condemnations that it has made towards the illegal occupation and illegal settlements in the Palestinian territories.
Yeah, so why I ask from a Palestinian point of view, because now if we look at international law, for instance, international law is clear, like you alluded to that in terms of the UN does not agree with the Israelis that the West Bank and the Gaza Strip are Israeli territory. But it looks at them as, according to international law, as occupied territories, and that whatever the Israeli practices are on those occupied territories are illegal under international law. So you want to say more about that, Bob?
Yes, it was just within the past 10 days that in this illegally occupied territory, a settler, and I call them thugs, they're terrorists, they set fire to a Palestinian vehicle, and they do it with impunity. They're never caught, never put under the justice system for it. Even more recently, perhaps 2 weeks ago, there was a lynching of 6 Palestinians in Jerusalem. One young man, I think he was 16 years old, was at the point of death until they resuscitated him. About 50 of these teenage Zionist Jewish thugs attacked these Palestinian people. And of course, the backdrop to that is that Israel is continuously colonizing East Jerusalem, which is Palestinian territory, and threatening and intending to take it all away from them. The most recent incident just happened 2 or 3 days ago when the Catholic monastery called Latrun Monastery in just on the outskirts of Jerusalem, basically, was attacked. Arson was applied to it, and it was vandalized at night, 2 to 3 o'clock in the morning, by an unknown number of assailants, but they have to be settler thugs because they spray painted on the walls of the monastery as they torched the entrance to the monastery. They sprayed graffiti on the walls which listed names of the illegal settlements, the outposts that Israel is required under international law to remove. So, you know, they're protesting that, of course. And what they do is apply what they call a price tag to the Palestinians. When their own government does something they don't like, they stick it to the Palestinians. And among other things, the names of these illegal outposts, they scrawled on the wall, and I almost hate to say this, Jesus is a monkey. Now that's what our Jewish allies and their children are saying about my Lord and Savior.
Yeah, that I mean, that's interesting. And do you hear about these things much in the news media, like say in the Western, in the United States?
Hardly at all.
Yeah. So where did
what I learned through internet sources is 90% at least of what I read. There's hardly a mention in any of the mainstream media.
Yeah. So what does that tell you, Raji? I mean,
well, what it tells me is, I think you're referring to not hearing it in the Western media,
yeah,
or the mainstream
hardly
media per
ever,
se.
Yeah.
That the mainstream media is biased. That's the immediate conclusion. And as to why it's biased, you know, if you look into it, which I have researched, the media, and that's a big word, by the way, the media. We're not just talking about news. We're talking about television. We're talking about radio. We're talking about newspapers. And most importantly, we're talking about film studios. And if they're not owned, they're definitely operated and administered by Zionists, and they're proclaimed Zionists. I mean, they don't even hide it. And so that's why it's biased. It's a pretty simple explanation. And so you will never get, or very rarely get, those stories. And so some people go, you know, like Bob and other enlightened people will go to more reliable sources on the internet to get that information. For me, it's very painful to do that. And so I can't, you know, do it because it's every day There's just incidents of injustice going on. So for me, I just, when something big happens, I'll hear it through family sources or through friends that, you know, are actually there in the country, or, you know, and they're involved in news reporting or something to that effect.
That's interesting. We are talking about Zionism and Zionists, but we haven't really defined what that might be. Bob, would you like to take a crack at that?
Sure, I'll take a
Yeah.
crack. Zionism is actually a movement that has been in Jewish theology for hundreds of years, actually. You know, a longing for Zion or Jerusalem. But in the late 1800s, due largely to discrimination and persecution of Jewish people in Europe, Zionism turned into a political and a militant realm. And that turned it again, in turn, to the search for a homeland for the poor Jews of the world who were so persecuted. And so in the first Zionist Congress of 1897, Theodor Herzl, who was the father of modern Zionism, they looked around and, you know, through some process, they finally settled on Palestine. It was recognized. 2 rabbis went there and said, the bride is beautiful, but she is already married to another man. So they didn't care about that. They started infiltrating Palestine, the Zionists did, to get out of Europe, to escape the clutches of the persecutors in Europe. And they had some legal entry into the country, but most of it was illegal. But Zionism then, through men named Jabotinsky and Chaim Weizmann and of course David Ben-Gurion, who was the first prime minister of Israel, Zionism grew through terrorism and really came to drive out 750,000 to 800,000 Palestinians by 1948 or so, and replace it with their own forces. And the Zionist movement has metastasized, I believe, into what I call a criminal psychosis, the way it is operating today. And that's where Zionism is today. And the Palestinians, of course, are always on the bottom of the heap.
Yeah. You mentioned, Raji, about like the international community or the world, the international community, like the United States and Britain and stuff, and the United Nations later on in 1947, you mentioned that they said a part of Palestine will be a Jewish state or an Israeli state, and another part is Palestinian state. So could you say more about that?
And as far as historically, like the
things
things that led up to that, or the things that came after that?
What did that mean? Like Israel, part of Palestine as Israel, and part of Palestine as Palestinian. In terms of how did that happen and why did it happen?
Okay, so how did it happen? Maybe a little history. I think it's important to understand who the Zionists are. I mean, you asked a question, and Bob answered it, you know, very gracefully, I believe, as to what Zionism is. It's a, you know, political movement that has evolved into a psychotic movement. In fact, whatever Nazism and fascism were, Zionism has perfected that. I mean, I would say it's Nazism on steroids. So that's what Zionism is. It was founded officially in the 1890s by Theodor Herzl. The goal of Zionism is to take the Jewish people of the world and convince them that they're under attack by the world and that they need and deserve an exclusive place for their own survival. So that's as far as what Zionism's goal is. You know, I wanted to just state that is the goal. As far as who the Jewish people are, I think anybody can go to the internet or other documentation, encyclopedias, history, and you can see that 90% of what the world's Jews today, people that are of the Jewish faith, are not even descendants of Sam. And we need to go back a little historically there. But Noah, if you believe the story of the Bible, Noah, there was the flood, and the only survivors were Noah and his 3 children, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. And in English, I think they say Japheth. And so the descendants of Shem are called Semites. And that's, of course, where Abraham came from and his descendants, leading all the way up to Jacob. God changed Jacob's name to Israel. He had 12 children, 12 sons, and that's the 12 tribes of Israel. So those descendants are Semites, but they only make up maybe 10% of today's Jews. And so if you can do your own history, I think I'll spend way too much time telling you how they came about. I can just mention that they're called Ashkenazi Jews. They take the name from Ashkenaz, who's actually the grandson of Japheth. Noah, his 3 children, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. Shem, once again, is the ancestor of Abraham and his descendants leading up to Jacob, who is Israel. But then Japheth, his grandson, is Ashkenaz, and so they're of a different lineage. 90% of today's Jews. In fact, they're basically European, Eastern European, to be more specific.
A lot of them are blonde and blue eyes and green eyes.
Yeah,
And,
I mean, and so the ones that are in fact Semitic look a lot like me. In fact, in many places I go, I'm mistaken for a Jewish person. And as far as Palestinians, who were the Palestinians for thousands of years, they are in fact Jewish, Christian, and Muslim. And so those were the Palestinians. So I just want to set that on the table. As far as the Zionist movement, they were very successful in infiltrating governments and government structures, namely the British government, and they were able to convince many of the leaders there, and specifically Lord Balfour, and he wrote a declaration around the end of the First World War promising that there would be a national homeland which satisfies the goal, one of the goals of Zionists, and that land would be in Palestine. Now, he was trying to be congenial about it and said, yeah, but we want to make sure we don't interfere with the welfare of the existing
non-Jewish communities, he called them.
Yeah, he called them non-Jewish
the overwhelming majority.
Yeah, which was the overwhelming majority. However, that's not what happened, as we know. I mean, we know that close to a million Palestinians were driven out. Hundreds of villages were just flattened, destroyed. And so that's never been repaired. And so by the time the World War II was over, and there was a lot of world sentiment for many reasons for the Jewish people, the United Nations got together and decided, okay, we're going to take this promise and try to see it to its manifestation. And they wrote a resolution and declared that the area called Palestine, which had been mandated by the British, by the way, since World War II, and so mandate is a fancy word for colony. It was another British colony. And so instead of it getting its freedom, like all the other colonies were getting their freedoms and their nationalistic independence around the world from Britain and other colonialists, instead of that happening, the United Nations said, what we're going to do is take 55% of the land, and we will call this Israel. And the other 45%, we'll call it Palestine. It'll be the Palestinian territories. And just to repeat what you said, that's the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem. And so those are officially supposed to be Palestine, but they never became. They were given to be administered by Jordan and Egypt. And in 1967, Israel attacked that land. So now I'm talking about things that came after the 1947 resolution by the United Nations. So Israel was actually formed and recognized in 1948, but the Palestinian territories just kind of remained in the control of Jordan and Egypt, who had some ulterior motives on their own. But in 1967, they were then attacked and occupied by Israel. That attack was illegal, of course. The United Nations Security Council condemned it. They ordered Israel out, which of course they didn't leave. They've been there ever since, maiming, hurting, stealing, building illegal settlements, bringing people from all over the world and arming them in these settlements to harass the indigenous peoples of even those territories.
Yeah.
Did I answer you sufficiently?
Yeah, no, that was pretty important. because this partition plan of 1947, it gave at that time, through a lot of migration of Jews into Palestine from like the 1880s on, they became by 1947 about 600,000, whereas you had like close to 2 million Palestinians. Yeah, so the partition plan gave 55% of geographic Palestine to the Israeli state, and then 45% to the Palestinian state. But in fact, even in the Israeli state, many Arab villages were there, Palestinian, Christian, Muslim, Druze villages. And so there were a lot of Palestinians who would live in the partitioned Israeli state, you see, and the partitioned Palestine and the Israeli state part. So it shows you, like, even they didn't have like enough critical mass of people to occupy, what was given to them by the partition plan in 1947, because there were still a lot of Palestinians in there. And so this is, I think, very important, because from there, they moved and took over way beyond the 55% allocated to them by the quote-unquote international community. One thing we need to say, in fact, that nobody had asked the Palestinians about whether they would like to do this or not, you see? So the Palestinians, of course, were against it.
But I think that's consistent with the way the West has done things. Sure. For a long time. We didn't ask the Indians if it was okay to take their land. Yeah. We didn't really ask the Hawaiians if it was okay to, occupy their land. We talked at high levels, if anything. Mm-hmm. At high levels means, some leaders may have talked to some other leaders and made deals or whatever. But for the most part, that's consistent. I mean, even the European countries, Spain, France, England, Portugal, the Netherlands, all of these, colonialists, they don't really bother to ask the indigenous peoples of the land if it's okay to come and colonize and usurp and exploit, etc. Yeah.
So, meaning I'm gonna lead up to the question of it was a criminal act and against international law. What really happened in Palestine in terms of taking that. And we know that the Israeli historian Ilan Pappé had written a book called The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, and his sources were archival materials, Zionist archival materials. Now they are called Israeli archival materials. So would you want to say a bit more about that, Bob?
Sure. Ilan Pappé wrote that book in 2006. And it is truly a wondrous work of scholarship. He's a detailed student, researcher, and historian. And I was most impressed when he, at the very beginning of the book, and then it was threaded through the book, where he would discourse about the plan, the plot of the Zionists. They would, the people who had come in legally or not, mostly illegally, would target a Palestinian village. And I recall that they would survey that village right down to the last goat, and they'd say, okay, there are 200 olive trees in this village, and a herd of 500 goats, and 300 women, and 500 men. So they really did that. They mapped out the entire area there, and I think they had a plan called Dalit or something like that. And
Plan Dalit, yeah.
that's when the terrorist Zionist forces, the Irgun and the Haganah and so forth, really started to exercise true terrorism and drive those people out in the hundreds of thousands. And I would like to say, too, I've always believed, and I believe I've read this, that one of the prime reasons that Palestine could not be set up as an independent country in, say, the 1949 time was, and that's why then Egypt and Jordan administered those territories. the Palestinian people have been driven out in such hundreds of thousands that they were just shattered. They had no polity. They had no means, really, of establishing their own country. And it wasn't until Yasser Arafat in the late 50s and 60s who began to coalesce the Palestinians around their own community that we began to get this sense of true nationalism and building a state. And we, of course, are still in the throes of that today, but we are still under belligerent and illegal and really horrific occupation of the Palestinian people.
Yeah, actually, this book by the Israeli historian Ilan Pappé is a very important piece of literature that needs to be read by people who are interested in terms of justice, and so that's an important thing. So now we have you folks have done what you call a treatise on the Holy Land, treatise on Holy Land justice, and we can like maybe discuss it after having given this kind of history to the situation. The reason for you writing this thing, what was it?
Well, the situation, the whole issue is very complex, number one. Number two, hardly anyone in the West is really knowledgeable about it because they get all their information. Most people don't go and look for independent news sources to get international news. And so all the information, they're misinformed. Let me just put it concisely. And number three, it required a simplification, a simple way of stating what the injustices that occurred in the Holy Land were, and that we, in the treaties, we kind of divided the injustices between ones that may be immediately remediable and ones that, you know, you can't do much about because the international community has kind of unwittingly or otherwise adopted, and it's kind of become, you know, a given thing. So we can go through that if you want. I think it's important to say, Ibrahim, that it's easy for us to sit here and talk about things, this is this and this is that, but it's also important for the listeners to know our sources of information. And as you brought up the author Ilan Pappé, most of our sources that we read, and we, you know, we'd love to give references out to, you know, the listeners as to where they can go on the internet or which books to buy. Most of the places we go are, in fact, either Israeli or Jewish, you know, and other scholars. But, you know, like I said, most of them are, in fact, you know, Jews. And that's because there's many Jews of conscience that understand the situation. They've done their own homework. And just like many Americans who realize what our government is doing and some of the, or a lot of the immoral acts that our government, you know, perpetrates, that's anti-constitution and anti what we preach as far as, you know, liberty and democracy for all. So there's a lot of Americans with good conscience that speak out, but there's also many Jewish people, and some of them may have been Zionists because they believe in Zion and they believe in a homeland, but once they realize what the real political entity called Zionism represents and what it perpetrates on a daily basis, then they, in fact, may not even call themselves Zionists at this point. They just will call themselves, you know, Jewish or independent or otherwise. So to me, that's important to say that. That's where our sources are from, not just, you know, other Christians or other Arabs or whatever. So as far as the reasons for coming up with the treatise, once again, we needed to get correct information, and we needed to try and do it in a simple form. One of the main goals of the treatise was to say, here's a set of injustices that has been recognized by the international community, the educated international community, the official international community, that being the United Nations and other international courts, and this is what needs to happen to rectify them. So, and we laid that out as simply as possible in the treatise, and we hope that document becomes a real document that is adopted by Palestinian authorities and other authorities around the world, and someone, God willing, will act upon it.
Yeah, I have the treatise on my laptop, so we can projected. We're not going to go through it blow by blow, but I just want to show the viewers. We have a forward, there's a forward, and then there's like a history. Injustice Part 1, you folks called it, and it goes through the history, like 1916, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and how Britain, France, and Russia, but after the Russian Revolution in 1917, Russia was out of that, so basically the Middle East was divided between the British and the French. And then the 1917 Balfour Declaration you talked about, that created Jewish, gave a promise, a British promise for the creation of Jewish homeland in Palestine, provided that the Commonwealth, I think, of the non-Jewish communities, they call it, although they were the majority. They didn't say the Arabs, for instance, or the Palestinians. They just called them as non-Jewish communities, which is a really interesting way of like dismissing the majority of the indigenous population. So that's 1917 is very important. And then the illegal immigration into Palestine between 1917 and 1946, the 1947 UN partition, and so forth. And then you spoke, Raji, about the destruction of Palestinian villages and towns and cities, actually. So, Bob, could you say a little bit more about that? You having read quite a bit about it, and also have read Pape. And Salman Abu Sitta, who is a Palestinian demographer, also talks about that, and he and Pape agree on a lot of stuff.
Abu Sitta is a really wonderful man. He has done just tremendous scholastic work in his career. And of course, you know, among the facets of raising these 450 to 500 villages and towns and cities in Palestine was that, you know, foundations would be left, just, you know, rocks in the ground, really. They have been identified. There are even good Jewish groups who go around now and identify these villages that were raised. But what the Zionists did, they brought in trees from Europe or somewhere, you know, not indigenous trees to the land, and they would forest over these Palestinian lands. I believe it was a form of guilt. They were just trying to, you know, erase any vestige of these villages from the face of the earth.
Or cover the crime.
That's it. That's very good. And so, you know, again, Pape goes into great detail on that. And, you know, we have anecdotal stories where, you know, people will be on tour through the Middle East, and they'll be able to go up there and look at where their ancestors used to live. In some of those villages, the village mosque may have been left there, but they're in ruins now. Or the village church was, you know, maybe just the steeple was left there or something. But really, they did a systematic, and one must admit, thorough job of desecrating a viable society, an agrarian society, and the wonderful people who lived there and had lived there for many, many centuries.
Yeah. And the other thing is that the ethnic cleansing of Palestine continues. I mean, it has not stopped. And one of the ways in which this ethnic cleansing has continued is in terms of repression and oppression of the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, so much so that people's homes have been demolished, for instance. Their land has been taken. A wall of separation, apartheid wall and other words, has been erected and still hasn't been completed, but almost there, has been erected to separate not only Palestinians from Israelis, but to separate Palestinians from Palestinians, and Palestinians from their lands, and Palestinians from their schools. So to go to your school, you have to, before the wall was erected, you just walk 5-10 minutes to get to school. Now it might take you 2 hours to get to school there, or to your land, like that sustains you, and you can out an existence from it, it's rather sometimes you cannot, they won't allow you to get there. So that is another crime against humanity according to international law. And the other thing, much of that wall of separation or separation wall has been erected on in the West Bank, and not on the line separating the West Bank from the state of Israel that was created in 1948. So, what does that? I mean, when you hear these things, what do you think? I mean, Bob.
Well, it's a manifestation of the mentality of the Zionists wanting it all. I remember reading back in 2002 that Ariel Sharon, who still exists in a coma today, he was perhaps prime minister then, or perhaps a minister, I don't remember, but he was actually opposed to the apartheid wall when they first began building it. And I believe the reason for that was that he you know, in his mind was he wanted it all. Yeah. He didn't want to leave the Palestinians 10 or 15% of their historical homeland. But he quickly came around, and then they started building that thing at a furious rate, desecrating the land. You can only imagine the damage to the ecosphere and the wild animals that were roaming around. And as you said, they have these gates manned by one 19-year-old soldier, and they might open it at 7 o'clock in the morning, or he might not. So, you know, 7 o'clock in the morning, 5:30 at night. So a farmer can't go, you know, routinely to his family, to his farmland as he wants to. And this wall is 25 feet in height in Jerusalem and surrounding areas. It has surrounded now, completely encircled Bethlehem, also I think Kalkilia. And it is really a defacement of the Holy Land, the land that Jesus trod 2,000 years ago.
Yeah, so you want to say anything more about the treaties?
Well, you had started to cover, I'm not sure how our time is, but
yeah, we still have some time.
you were kind of looking at the injustices it was laying out, part one. And as we saw in the injustices of part one, I don't know if you want to show it up on the screen or not, but all of those things have become accepted as, you know, things that are. And that's, you know, the fact that 78% of historic Palestine is now considered Israel. And so those things, because they're accepted internationally, even though it's unjust, that's nothing, that would be extremely difficult to do anything about, if not impossible. So the injustices in part two, which is, I think, the crux of the treaties, we wanted to make sure and be, you know, educated about it and say, these are injustices. This should never have happened, but it did, and that's the way it is. But the part two injustices are dealing with the crimes against humanity, as you brought out, you know, and there's been a lot of crimes. We didn't mention some of the villages that were just, you know, they were razed, and women and children were murdered. Okay, we just don't, nobody in the world accepts that to happen, except it's okay for Israel to do it. So they did it, nothing's ever been done about it. The apartheid wall you mentioned already, the right of return, which is a guaranteed right for Palestinians and any other refugees by the United Nations. That's a guaranteed right that has been refused by Israel to Palestinians. For instance, well, I don't know if I have time for the story, but I can't even go back, except that the fact that I have an American passport. I can go back, but when I do go back, I have to go to the separate line and be humiliated in what's called the Arab line when I'm going through security. And that's not even in Israel. That's getting on board a plane heading toward Israel, wherever you're at, London, Paris, New York. You're already dealt with in a non-Israel country. You're already humiliated and strip searched and whatever. And then when you get to Israel, then that's another thing. And then even leaving the country, humiliation, 2 and 3 hours of humiliation. So when I went just recently with my brother to take my parents' ashes, I mean, not only did they confiscate the ashes, and it took us months to get back my parents' ashes, this is just cruelty, you know, that is being exercised by the government. So these kind of things are just rampant as far as how they treat Palestinians, whether they're the ones that are living there, poor folks, or the ones that have, in the wider diaspora, the ones that are, you know, living like myself as an American or otherwise. Then there's the undeclared nuclear arms. This is against all international. You can't have, now we're going after Iran these days. You're talking about current events, and Israel is going to probably find a way to convince the U.S. to, attack Iran, and if they don't, they'll attack Iran on their own. I mean, I'm just guessing. But meanwhile, Israel has undeclared nuclear arms, and they've refused the umpteen number of years of the United Nations demanding that they let the area be, investigated by the UN. They've refused, and of course they're not enforced, so they can get away with it. The attack and occupation of the Palestinian territories from 1967, the building of illegal settlements, and also the practice of apartheid within Israel. Now, even though Israel, the 78% of the land, belongs to Israel, and it's a Jewish state, as you mentioned earlier, there's other non-Jewish people living there. Now, besides the non-Ashkenazi Jews that are kind of discriminated against as well, they're considered second-class citizens. Anybody else, whether you're a Christian or a Muslim or any offshoot of that, Durzi or Protestant or whatever, you're going to be discriminated against. It's just like South Africa, but on steroids. And this is going on within Israel, and this is an injustice. So what the treaties does then is it deals with the steps required to alleviate those, and we don't have time probably for all of that, but I think I wanted to point out those injustices and what it takes to alleviate those injustices.
Yeah, I mean,
rectify them.
I think this is an important thing. The question of the right of return is critical in terms of the historic narrative, and that is the United Nations passed a law, a resolution, to say that Palestinians have the right to return. That was 1949.
194.
Resolution 194. This is a very important resolution. And they told the Israelis that you cannot become a member of the United Nations unless you allow the Palestinians to return to their homelands. The Israelis said, okay, but let us in. So they became members of the United Nations, and then they told them, go fly a kite to the United Nations. And so far, that right of return has not occurred. So this is an interesting thing.
Here's an irony that I think it's worth mentioning for people to get a real picture of things. Because these 800,000, and now that's become 4 million after so many years, refugees are living in camps and living in horrible situation. They're not allowed to return. But what did the United Nations do as a consolation prize? They said since about 50 or 51, there's an annual resolution that keeps getting renewed that gives financial and monetary assistance for those refugees. So there's money allocated by the world governments, which everyone pays for. I'm not sure if Israel pays for it, but everyone else.
Israel.
But all the countries of the United Nations chip into a fund, and that's how the United Nations is funded. So we give monies to give to these refugees, which brings medical assistance, food assistance, education, and some things to help with their housing. They take this stuff over, and Israel either doesn't allow them to come in because they're controlling the borders. So that's one part. B, they may allow them to come in, and wherever they're stored, they'll send a missile in there and blow it up. And so that's the joke of things, is that Israel has denied they've resisted, they've broken the international law, not allowing the right of return of Palestinian refugees. And the money that the United Nations has tried to, in good conscience, use to assist these people is being wasted in other ways. And so I just wanted to mention that.
No, that's very good. Would you like to add anything to that, Bob?
Well, as far as the treatise goes, I would like to say that when Raji and I were conceiving this document that became a treatise, manifesto, same thing, we were looking at it in a more in an international context. We saw that South Africa had done something very similar to this, and it was important to both of us. And then I think Raji really ran with this, but we had the BDS declaration in Palestine in 2005. Which started the movement, an economic movement toward boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel in opposition to its occupation. And then the Christian community came out, and I was really happy with that. in 2007. It came out with the Kairos document. And now that was renewed again in Bethlehem in 2009.
What does it say, that document?
Well, that document very forcefully says that Christians are outraged at the occupation, that it is wrong, and that we must, exercise St. Paul's faith, hope, and love, but that the Kairos document insists that the Palestinians be given their due rights in the Holy Land. And finally, then, this treatise, we view it, we think will be viewed as another plank or another platform whereby we have a body of documentation that sets forth the Palestinian rights and what they need and require to become a viable state of their own.
Yeah, I'm just going to read, because I think it's very important in the time remaining to talk about what you call justice essentials. Okay, we've talked about what the problems were and how it developed and all this, that particular situation, and the racism that Israel exercises over against the Palestinians, and even against Jews from Arab countries. You know, they are the second-class citizens we talked about because the Ashkenazi Jews are number one. Yeah, although we might say, like a lot of these Arab Jews or Jews from Arab countries really are very Zionist, even though they are discriminated against, and they hate the other Arabs, who are Christian and Muslim. So that shows you like the brainwashing that has gone through in that. But it is important to look at the justice essentials. One point is Israel must immediately, unconditionally, and completely withdraw from the illegal occupied Palestinian territories. And here we're talking about West Bank and Gaza Strip. So you want to say something about that?
Only to add that East Jerusalem, which was illegally annexed, needs to be de-annexed as well. But
Right. That's another thing. Like flagrant violation of international law, which says that occupied territories must not be annexed. And so what do the Israelis say in flagrant violation of international law? They go and annex an occupied territory. Another thing international law says, you cannot change or transform the occupied territories in ways that would become like would make it a different kind of space, not the original space. Like, for instance, you cannot cut olive trees and build like homes in there because that's like, occupation is doing this. You cannot migrate people from one place to another and kick the indigenous people out because this is like changing the character and the nature of the place and so forth. So they do that though, and they have done that, and they still do it on a daily basis, basically, especially in Jerusalem these days. UN must sanction Israel for international law broken during the last 65 years.
Just like the examples that you were giving.
Right. UN must, Israel must honor the inalienable right of return of displaced Palestinians. So what do they say, the Israelis, about that?
Well, they'll never, according to them, that'll never happen.
Yeah, that because they say, well, this has been a long time ago, like 65 years ago. And we want, if we bring all the Palestinians in, then this would not be a Jewish state any longer. Well, actually, it's not a Jewish state anyway right now, because if you're saying a Jewish state, then you're talking about an exclusive kind of character for that particular state, which means like 20% of the residents of the state of Israel are Palestinians, Christian and Muslim and Druze. They are not Jewish. How can you be, on the one hand, democratic, as they claim, and at the same time exclusivist and not give equal rights to the 20% of the Palestinians living there. And then there are others, like there are Russians who are not Jews who live there, and other people as well.
There's only one answer to that question, which is, I know you're asking it rhetorically,
Yeah.
but that's to have an apartheid state.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
That's what it is.
And therefore, an apartheid state is not a democratic state. So to say that Israel is a democratic state is really flies in the face of the truth. And without truth, there cannot be any justice. So anyway, so that's Israel must immediately release all administrative detention prisoners. Yeah. So because what they do, they just pick up people and put them in jail, regardless of what they did or didn't do.
No charge,
Yeah.
no representation, no
Yeah,
phone call.
no, detained like forever, the detention forever. This is also a flagrant violation of international law. So a lot of those things are being done, and the United States did not do anything about it. In fact, I don't know if you watched the Democratic Party convention, National Convention last night. They, in violation of international law, the Democrats said that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. And this is against international law. Even now, the Democrats are trying to overtake the Republicans, in terms of, we are with Israel even more than the Republicans, and we have recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, as the eternal capital, perhaps, of Israel, etc., as the Israelis talk about it. So that is a very bad thing, because here the strongest country in the world, I mean, they have the National Democratic Party, and also Obama, as the president who's running for re-election, he agrees with that,
Of course he does, because
yeah.
he's a puppet of the administration. I mean,
Yeah,
you have
yeah.
to do what the party tells you.
Yeah. One thing about to the party, that in terms of some correspondents were saying, well, it was a voice vote, and in fact, it was equal. Like some people say no, some people say yes. So basically, it's 50-50. It's not like, but I think mayor of LA said, oh, well, after the third time they did that, said, it's clear to me that the people who want to pass the resolution as Jerusalem is the eternal capital of Israel have won,
Can I just say something real quick? Because I
Sure.
know we're running out of time.
Yeah.
But the treatise is available at holylandpeace.net. That's the
.net.
website.
Yeah.
So then anybody can go read it for themselves
Right.
and see all this stuff.
Yeah, and then you can read more books written by Israeli Jews and by American Jews and by Australian Jews and all kinds of Jews writing against that situation, because they say that not in my name as a Jew would I want you to do that. You can do it by another name, but not by my name, because my Jewish ethics don't tell me not to do these kinds of things, instruct me not to do these kinds of apartheid and racist behavior. So we're basically flat out of time, and I want to thank you folks for coming over and talking about this very important subject, especially for the United States, because we're fighting there, right? I mean, we don't want to get into more trouble there just because of bad propaganda that takes us down the garden path. So that's very important. And thank you for watching, and see you in October. Okay, thank you.